This church leader tool is called the Outward Focused Ministry. And as I continue to serve the church and work with other churches, I wonder if there are few decisions that are as important as whether a congregation is going to be inward focused to only help people grow as followers of Jesus within the life of the congregation, or outward focused and help others to come to a relationship with Jesus. We're going to wrestle with this really important distinction. So let's talk first about some inward focused dynamics of why this happens. One of those, and maybe most primary, is that we're sinful. Martin Luther, his description of sin was curved in on oneself. That as an individual, we're sinful when we're curved in on ourselves. But it isn't just individuals that do this. Organizations or churches can do this as well. They get curved in on themselves. It's a natural dynamic that, like our sinful lives, needs to be fought to focus outward on God and others. So it's natural, but it can be fought. It's also, honestly, easier to see people who are at a congregation rather than those who aren't. And so it takes a special set of eyes and focus to think about those who are not at the congregation and how you can reach out and connect with them. And thirdly, it sometimes, in fact, often causes discomfort when a church starts to focus outward. In fact, sometimes people in a church will say, if you make that change, I'm going to leave. And so sometimes churches will bow to those folks who are already in the church and their wishes and desires. But as a really wise church leader taught me early on in my ministry, he said, Pastor, we've had people leave through the years because we weren't changing. And it started to internalize to me, well, would I rather have someone leave because we were changing and becoming more outward focused, or because we weren't? And of course, I'd rather that if somebody has to leave, it's because we were outward focused on helping new people connect with faith. And fourthly, maybe a statement that is worth wrestling with church leaders is this one. Reaching out to new members is just as important as taking care of the present members. How that question is answered really will determine the life, health, vitality of a congregation. So then let's talk for a moment about why it is important to have an outward focus. Well, the first reason is very simple. Churches die without adding new people. It's a basic fact of numbers that because people in the congregation die and they relocate and they transfer out, that if a church does not have an influx of new people, there is no way to control the fact that people die, they relocate, they move, and they sometimes go to other churches. So you must have that influx. In fact, a quick story here. I had a church member tell me about his previous church where they were having a conversation about folks that had left. And one person noted, well, a lot of those folks had just passed away. They had died. It wasn't that people were leaving the church. They just had died. And another person said, but I want them back. And the guy said he knew that was the time it was time to leave that church, because when they couldn't face the fact that loved ones and friends had died and were never coming back, that he thought it's time for a new church. So it's a basic fact of numbers. In fact, some further ideas about numbers. It is a basic rule of thumb that church consultants talk about, that you need 1 to 2 guests every week per 100 people at worship, just to stay even. Because of people dying, relocating, and transferring, you need to have 1 to 2 guests per 100 every week. That's just to stay steady. And then to grow, 2 to 3 guests or more, depending on how you want to grow. So it's just a basic fact of numbers. You need to have those new folks coming in. And it's also a challenge for many churches that by the time we've slowly slipped into a place that's too small, it's untenable to get things going again. So it's worth paying attention to those numbers of activity in the life of the church. We've seen that in many, many churches. We've seen that in many, many denominations. So that's a basic fact. Second, it keeps the leadership pool refreshed, brings in new energy, new ideas, new experiences into the leadership of the church when you have new people coming in. Thirdly, it keeps your ministry sharpened, even for folks who are already members. If you're thinking about guests, for example, ways to welcome guests or ways to better communicate with guests, that is also going to benefit folks who are already in the congregation. So it just helps to sharpen your ministry for everybody who's there. And it's also vital to our Christian walk. Our faith in Jesus, if it is real and alive, it is something that we will want to share. So if it's not worth sharing, then our own faith journey is atrophying. By the same token, if our own faith journey is vibrant and alive, we're going to want to share that with other folks. And lastly, it is basic to the mission of the church. We know that at the end of each of the Gospels, most clearly in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus told us to go out, go therefore and make disciples. We know that commission that Jesus gave us. And when we don't follow through on that, our faith, our commitment dies a little bit inside when we are not faithful to what Jesus told us to do. So that is some of the why. Let's talk for a moment now about the how to have a more outward-focused ministry. So first, think about your communication from the perspective of an unchurched guest. Somebody comes into your church, your worship service, and is a guest. What will they not understand? What's insider language? What terms and descriptions need to be more helpful for someone who doesn't have a church background? Just start to think about all of your communication. What is insider based? One of my favorite examples that I always hate to see is a church in an announcement that will say, well, if you're interested in this, talk to Martha. But if you're a guest, you don't know who Martha is. Think like a guest and help explain and guide people to the things that they need in order to grow in faith and get connected with the life of a congregation. What forms of communication will connect with an outsider better than an insider? Think about those different things. If you can't see it yourself, ask a guest to come and visit for the purpose of evaluating as an outsider. What doesn't make sense? You know, a friend or a family member, or if you know someone who's unchurched, best of all. So second, understand the importance of an environment. I think it was Andy Stanley that I heard one time describe if you were inviting some guests over to your house, some people who'd never visited you, what would you do to prepare for them and to make them feel comfortable? And in that same way, think about the environment of your church for someone who's a first-time guest. What information, what would help them? Think about your environment in that way. One of my favorite exercises that I've mentioned in other church leader tools is to take a team of leaders and walk out to the edge of the property and then walk in pretending it's the first time you're there. And you'll notice stuff that you've come to overlook because you're a regular member of the church. Third, think, how can I help someone grow in faith rather than how can they help us grow? And, you know, that would seem perfectly obvious, but I worked with a church years ago that out on their brand new sign, as they were trying to be revitalized, said, "Come help us grow." It was so obvious that they only wanted folks to come to help the life of the church. We need to think, how can we help someone else grow as a follower of Jesus to bless their lives? And unfortunately, that church that had that sign out front did close because they had this wrong. It shouldn't be how people can help the church, but it's how the church can help someone else. Then fourth, prayer is always important. Look for ways to pray for people outside the church and people who do not have a faith relationship yet. Add that to your prayer team. Use that in your prayers at worship. Use it in your private prayers. Find ways to pray for those outside the life of the church. And then fifth, look for multiple entry points, different ways for people to connect with the life of the church apart from worship. Worship for most churches is the largest entry point, but there are lots of other ways to connect with the community, to host events at the church, to have the church have an open door, to get active out in the community and interact with people so that there's different opportunities. Those could be service activities, those could be fellowship activities, those could be events and concerts, they could be small groups, but multiple ways for someone to connect with the life of the church always helps to bring new folks in. Sixth, evaluate how you spend your resources. That is time, money, and energy. Be an easy thing, for example, to look at a church budget and how much of it is inward focused and how much of it is outward focused. And in many churches, the money, the time, and the energy is all or mostly spent inward. Start to reallocate some of that toward an outward focus. And then also think clear, easy steps. If somebody new were to come into the life of the church, how could you easily help them take some next steps to grow in faith? Things that might be more obvious for a church member are not at all obvious for a new person. So help make it easy for them to learn about growing in faith, how to pray deeper, how to read the Bible, how to get involved in fellowship activities, how to serve in the life of the church. Help them take those easy steps. Also, listen to the feedback from outsiders. You may not be able to learn some of the things you need to hear from those who are already or long time a part of a congregation, but if you listen to those who are new, they will help you evaluate simple things like the bathrooms aren't obvious for where they are for a new guest, or how to get involved and sign up for something. Listen to that feedback from new folks. And then lastly, a great question to ask is, what are we willing to do to reach people who are outside the church or outside the faith? What are we willing to do? Where are we willing to spend time, energy, effort, thought in connecting with someone? That's a great question to ask. And I know for some churches, that's a basic principle that they'll put themselves out there to help connect with someone. And lastly, make sure you share this church leader tool with some other leaders, either in your context or others you know who need to have a more outward focused ministry. Take care and God bless.